Domestic violence has traditionally been understood as a crime perpetrated by men against women. On the 23rd of August 2015, 51-year-old David Edwards was murdered in his home in Chorley, Lancashire. The facts surrounding his death and the shocking events leading up to it would challenge preconceptions about male domestic abuse. David Edwards was well loved by those close to him.
A proper gentleman, funny as anything, always smiling, had a lot to say. A very keen Chorley football fan. Every match he went, he bought a shirt.
David had a brilliant personality and we connected straight away. He was very light-hearted, easy to get on with, passionate about his football, about his job.
And it was David's professional abilities that gained him respect locally.
David was a very, very popular criminal lawyer. He loved his job. He was driven by it. I used to go to court as well and watch him because I found it absolutely breathtaking the way he performed.
After meeting on a night out at a local pub, David and Debbie's relationship went from strength to strength as a couple prepared to welcome a new arrival.
I was pregnant and David was absolutely over the moon. He really wanted a child of his own because he'd never had one. He was ecstatic. David was perfect during my pregnancy. He looked after me, cooked for me. He came to all the scans, the hospital appointments.
And when daughter Mahalia was born, David was thrilled.
It was very emotional seeing David holding her for the first time, with tears rolling down his face. It was a happy moment. I came out of hospital and David helped with the night feeds. David would change the nappies. He was a very good dad.
They had many happy years as a family, but when Mahalia was 5, the cracks started to appear.
Man and David's relationship started to fizzle out, but we remained really, really good friends. I was still cooking for him and doing his washing. We did speak about getting back together.
But sadly, the couple were never to reconcile. After 7 months apart, David had embarked on a new relationship with 41-year-old Sharon Manser. They had first met many years ago when David was representing Sharon's ex-partner.
They seemed very happy, but very early on into the relationship, David had got a broken collarbone and he said he'd fallen downstairs. I had no reason to disbelieve him at the time.
Sharing a daughter with David meant Debbie and Sharon would, of course, inevitably come into contact.
The very first time I saw Sharon, she was outside my door, kicking at it. I'd just come home from work. Mahalia was supposed to be going to a party. David was picking her up. But they'd both been drinking till the early hours of the morning. And I said, no, you're not driving her anywhere while you've been drinking. And that's the reason she came to the house and was kicking my door to try and get Mahalia out. We more or less had a massive argument at the front. I took an instant dislike to her.
Debbie was still keen for Mahalia to have a relationship with her father, and satisfied her daughter would be safe, she allowed David access.
Mahalia would go and stay over. I didn't have a problem with that. Sharon seemed nice with Mahalia.
But as Sharon and David's relationship progressed, Debbie grew concerned about David.
He would turn up to collect Mahalia and he'd have bruises, black eyes, burst lips, scratches. Each time I asked him what he'd done, he'd say he'd fallen or he'd walked into a wall or a garage door.
I noticed some scratches on his face. And I said to Dave, what's happened to you? Oh, a cat scratched me. I said, it's a cat? I said, Dave, your ear's bleeding and your glasses are twisted. Oh, yeah. I fell over. I said, you just told me the cat's done it. So he lied to me. And I knew something was going on.
It was becoming clear to those around him that David's injuries were far from accidental.
On Father's Day 2015, David had rang me up to say that he couldn't have Mahalia that day, which I thought was terrible. So I thought I'd go down to the house and confront him. When I got there, David was a mess. He'd got deep scratches down the side of his face, 2 black eyes, busted lip, fingerprint bruising around his neck, and he was trembling. I could understand then that he didn't want Mahalia to see him in that state. I said, what's happened? Has she done this to you? He said, no, I've fallen. I just said, you don't get fingernail scratches falling. That was when I realised how bad it was. The severity of that attack was terrible.
But eventually, David did start to confide in others that Sharon was responsible for his injuries.
I think he'd admitted to a few of his work colleagues some of the things she were doing, like throwing ashtrays at him, a glass table. But he wouldn't take it any further. He wouldn't press charges, he just denied everything.
I met him and he had a big cut across his nose, all the way across. He just said, Sharon had a drink and she's hit me with the phone. I was a bit shocked because he was very soft, Dave, and I don't think he's ever met a woman like that.
In the wake of these revelations, rather than split with Sharon, David had plans to cement their relationship.
He told me he was getting married. I did ask him not to do it. I said, because I think things will get worse once you've made her your wife.
He said to me, if I don't go, she will kill me. I said, who does she think she is? I said, I'll go and speak to her. He said, Cougar, please don't tell her I told you this. I have to marry her.
Exactly 12 months to the day that they'd started dating, David and Sharon were married in a 10-minute ceremony at a Las Vegas chapel.
It was just those two that attended it. I don't know what hold she had over him, but obviously she had a big hold because he still went ahead and did it. The night before the wedding in Las Vegas, she'd hit him with the phone and he had a black eye because on his wedding pictures he's got foundation on, covering a black eye, but you can clearly see it on some of the pictures.
Rather than marital bliss, on their return, things got even worse for David.
She wouldn't let me speak to him after the wedding. She said everything I had to say had to go through her. I saw him, obviously, a few times, but she was always stood at the side of him. I couldn't speak to him on my own. Physically and emotionally, he was a mess. He'd lost so much weight. He'd started to stoop. He wouldn't look people in the face. It was so sad to see such a big 6'2" man to look like that.
It wasn't just friends and family who noticed David's demise.
I believe his work suffered. He weren't turning up for work. He letting his clients down, and that was not David. He never ever did that when I was with him. She kept turning up at work and making a nuisance of herself, threatening his staff, his secretary.
His secretary said Sharon's been to the office and kicking off. First she's been blowing the phone up because I said he's out in court. She didn't believe me. She's come down and kicked off with me at the office.
Up until now, Debbie had allowed Mahalia to continue to see her father. But an event nearly 4 weeks after the wedding pushed Debbie to breaking point.
He'd got a massive cut on the bridge of his nose. Again, he was trembling. He'd lost so much weight. He was a mess. From that day, I actually stopped all contact. Basically said to David, if you want to see her, you come up to my house on your own, or I'll meet you somewhere on your own. I said, but my daughter is going nowhere near her.
After this incident, it was 2 weeks before Debbie heard from David.
He rang me up and he was absolutely heartbroken. He said he was missing Mahalia. And his words were, my life's hell down there. He said, I'm living in hell. And I basically said, you need to get out, you need to leave her. So if you don't, David, she's going to kill you. And that's the last conversation I had with him.
Sadly, David did not heed Debbie's warning. And 19 days later, on the 24th of August 2015, Debbie got a knock on the door.
I answered the door and they said that they were police officers. I'm like, have I done something wrong? So they came in and the words were, there's no easy way to tell you this, but David was killed last night. And my instant reaction was, has she done it?
Coming up, shocking footage is revealed of David and Sharon just hours before his death.
The police came across David and Sharon arguing in the street, both very drunk. Sharon was predominantly the aggressor, and that was captured on the body-worn video.
Right, get off me! Don't you dare touch me! Don't you go back down there! Don't you dare touch me!
Well-respected criminal solicitor David Edwards had married girlfriend Sharon after only 12 months of dating. But their union was ill-fated from the outset. As for most of their fledgling relationship, David had been suffering abuse at Sharon's hands. Now only 2 months into their marriage, David was lying dead in his own bed. And surprisingly, it was wife Sharon who'd raised the alarm.
Sharon came out hysterical that David wasn't breathing, asking someone to call an ambulance, and a neighbour actually used Sharon's phone to do that. The ambulance service attended the home address. They had made an assessment that it was suspicious. He was laying in the bed with a clear puncture wound to his chest and been bleeding from that. In addition to that, Sharon had already alluded to the ambulance service that they had had an argument and at some point a knife had been involved. Attending officers made the decision that they would arrest her on suspicion of murder.
Sharon was taken into custody at Preston Police Station.
When Sharon was initially interviewed, she was in complete denial that David was actually dead. She wouldn't believe the police officers, as she repeatedly insisted on speaking to her husband. She was also in denial around her culpability. Her account was that her and David had argued. They'd both torn up some wedding photographs, and it resulted in him arming himself with a knife in the kitchen, which she somehow managed to take off him, and she believes that he walked in onto the blade, and that resulted in the stab wound to his chest.
But the police were not convinced by Sharon's elaborate story, and it was down to Dean Holden and his team to uncover the truth surrounding David's death.
What we learned very quickly is that Sharon was a very aggressive, volatile individual, so it was my belief from the outset that she was definitely capable of wanting to cause someone serious harm.
The police needed to gather evidence to prove that Sharon Edwards had murdered her husband, and the scene of the crime was Dean's first port of call.
The house was quite a nice house in a nice locality. Within the house, it was quite unkept. There was clear evidence of quite a lot of alcohol abuse. Both David and Sharon were heavy drinkers. But in terms of the kitchen and the actual scene of the stabbing, it was relatively clean. And what was obvious is that there had been some element of a clean-up operation. Where David was found was an upstairs bedroom. The mattress was very stained with blood. David had probably lain there bleeding out from his injury.
The pathology report concluded that David's cause of death was a single stab wound to the heart, immediately disproving Sharon's account of events.
The concept of Sharon saying David walked onto the knife is impossible, basically. It must have been some level of force to go through his chest and into his heart.
The pathologist also disclosed that David's death would have been slow.
Because there was such a slight nick to the heart, the blood would have seeped out over a period of time. What Sharon did say in interviews is that she wanted to call an ambulance, but he told her not to. You'll never know whether that's true or not. But a hypothesis is that he was stabbed much earlier, died, and that Sharon may have spent an hour or two actually contemplating what to do. Her hysterical nature when she came out of the house was actually all an act, just for neighbours. A bit of theatre really to try and make people believe that she was as shocked as anybody else.
Locating witnesses was key to the investigation, particularly those who'd seen the couple in the early hours leading up to David's death.
David and Sharon had visited the local off-licence the night before, and the shopkeeper and two customers actually witnessed quite a hostile verbal altercation whereby Sharon was very aggressive towards David, so much so that the customers tried to intervene and calm her down.
Unbelievably, the police themselves actually caught on camera the couple's volatile state that night, just 18 hours before David was reported dead.
The police came across David and Sharon arguing in the street, both very drunk. Sharon was predominantly the aggressor, and that was captured on the body-worn video.
What's going on? Hi. Yeah, what's happening? Because I've just come round that roundabout and seen you ragging him around. So you're going to tell me what's happening?
We're drunk and we're going home. Yeah.
Come take a seat in the back of my car while I can get somebody else to come and speak to your partner.
I don't think so.
I do. I'm not asking.
Will you listen to the live please?
Oh, David. Seriously? Seriously? Solicitor or no solicitor?
Right,
Get off me! Don't you dare touch me!
Don't you go back down
Don't
there.
you dare touch
Right.
me!
A possible reason for Sharon's escalation in anger that night could have been down to the fact that David had recently lost his job.
David's employment came to a conclusion because they'd lost a little bit of confidence in David and his ability to operate because of the way he was coming to work, dishevelled, sometimes smelling of alcohol, but also with injuries. Sharon, I think, took this quite badly, and I think the perception is that Sharon quite liked being the solicitor's wife.
David, she touched me! She touched me! She touched me!
Sit down, okay?
No, she touched me!
Yes, and I'll touch it again unless you shut up and calm down. I will arrest you.
Please,
Okay.
shut up.
The irony is that Sharon's attraction to David, we think, is his status as a very respected local solicitor, a very good job, nice house, and no doubt a good salary. And bit by bit, she chipped away and almost dismantled that and destroyed that. And what was left then was a man without his job, mounting debts, a house that should have been nice but was looking somewhat dishevelled. And physically, David was a different man.
The luxury life David's job had afforded the couple was to become a thing of the past. And as the witnesses and body cam footage suggest, in the hours leading up to David's death, Sharon was a woman capable of violence. The police did not arrest Sharon.
The police assessed the situation and chose on that occasion to take them both home, mainly because David denied that he'd been assaulted and that his injuries were as a result of a fall, and they'd had a disagreement.
We're going to get a free lift home.
Where?
Take
Free lift home. What did you think? Free lift home. You idiot. Come on, free lift home. Move.
Even at this stage, David was still protecting Sharon and lying about the cause of his injuries. Mark Brooks, who provides support for male victims of domestic abuse, thinks he knows why.
Men often don't come forward because they feel a sense of shame. It undermines their whole sense of what it means to be a man, undermines their self-worth and also their pride. But importantly, also they feel that they won't be believed, that if they do come forward, that they will be laughed at and not taken seriously.
But as the couple were taken home by police car, Sharon's departing words were a chilling prophecy for what lay ahead.
I swear, David, when I wake up tomorrow, I don't know what mood I'm going to be in.
There you go, Sharon.
Thank you,
Not a
officer.
problem.
Oh, why have you been so nice?
Because you've been nice to me, haven't you?
I'm still going to have to kill. But when I say I kill him, I'm not literally going to kill him.
Hours later, David was dead. Helped along by statements from friends, family and work colleagues, police were building a true picture of David's environment of abuse, and his medical records contained further evidence.
We believe that there was an altercation where he was probably assaulted by Sharon, which resulted in his admission to A&E in Bolton. David did actually make a disclosure to them that he was the victim of domestic abuse and that Sharon was responsible for his injuries on that night. They did make some referrals into the appropriate agencies, but unfortunately that didn't come to any great fruition in terms of safeguarding, probably because David, when he reflected on it, would tell lies or cover up for Sharon's behaviour.
He didn't have the confidence to actually go through a complete disclosure. And also, at the back of his mind, he always was in fear of Sharon.
Sadly, David continued to live with Sharon's regular attacks, further evidence in the post-mortem results.
The pathologist noted between 50 and 60 non-accidental injuries about his body, some of which were poke and prod wounds, consistent possibly with a sharp implement, and his assessment was that he'd been the victim of sustained violence over a period of time.
The police had enough evidence to charge Sharon with David's murder.
Sharon was never released on bail. She remained in custody, and eventually we got authorisation from the Crown Prosecution Service to charge her with murder, and she was remanded. She's always denied any culpability, not only in relation to the fatal stabbing, but also that she was physically abusing him.
With Sharon pleading not guilty, the case went to trial.
It was very important that I was there. I needed to be there. Then in later years, I can actually tell Mahalia what happened.
It was never really clear what her defence case was, but it seemed to range from an accidental stabbing to self-defence to possibly David having done it himself. And even when Sharon gave evidence, it was still not clear around what her defence was.
When they played videos of David, she broke down and started screaming. She wouldn't look at anybody.
She was quite vocal sometimes when individuals were given evidence, to the point where the judge had to warn her to behave and to be quiet. Well, I think it's fair to say that she was probably quite problematic during the trial for all concerned.
But the jury received a true reflection of the abuse David was living with on a daily basis. They even heard it from David himself. Police had recovered David's side of a conversation with Sharon, which he'd accidentally recorded after leaving his dictaphone running.
He has a conversation with Sharon saying that they have to come up with a different idea as to how he sustained the injuries because no one's buying the garage door story.
We're going to have to refine the excuse for me eye. You know, the garage door that we made up? That doesn't wash, I've just told Chris, and he's not having it. You said to me, I'd like to think that I could punch you and knock you out with a single punch. Well, I've told you, you do it rather hard, Sharon, don't you?
And after a 2-week trial, the verdict was in.
She was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 20 years, so she'll have to serve 20 years before she can apply for parole. She became very tearful and reacted, as you would expect, really very upset. My personal view is I think she's upset because she's been caught out and she's facing 20 years in prison, as opposed to the fact that she feels remorseful for what she did.
It was a very good feeling, but that won't bring Dave back. And I thought, you deserve to rot in hell.
For David, it was too late, but the lessons learnt from this case are now being used to help others.
The thing that surprised me most about David's murder is how many red flags that were missed by many individuals to intervene. It just seems a real pity that we didn't put all those pieces together collectively and prevent it escalating to a murder.
If a man gives information that leads you to suspect he is a victim of domestic abuse, you have a moral responsibility to call 999 or go to the police station. You can't just rely on the person who is a victim, who is psychologically and mentally controlled, to actually do all of that.
Fortunately, male domestic abuse is increasingly being recognised, and the Mankind Initiative charity is one of the agencies there to help.
We give men the confidence that they're not alone, they're not to blame, and they're not weak, and that they can escape.
We had a sale of David's football shirts. He had a collection of probably well over 600, and we had donated all the money to Mankind. He was well liked, he was lovable, he was a cheeky character. I'm just one of those people, and I will do my best to keep his memory alive for his daughter.
It's a common misconception that only women can be victims of domestic abuse. But David's story goes to prove that men are also at risk. Hopefully in its retelling, other lives will be saved, and male victims will come forward to report this horrific crime.